Awesome. All right, with that, it is 2:04. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with things. But before I do that, are there any final questions from any of you that I can go ahead and answer before I jump into things? If you've got any last minute questions that you thought of, feel free to throw up a raise hand function and I will make sure to answer them as efficiently as possible. Okay, cool. Seeing none, I'm going to go ahead and bounce straight into things. So welcome everyone to this professional development session, specifically focusing on how to engage and prepare your students to succeed within Model UN committees. We're super excited to have all of you here and to share all of these Model UN skills and this knowledge with every single one of you. And a huge thank you to Global Classrooms DC for hosting this event. We see it as being super impactful for students across the country and for educators. So again, thank you all for coming. In terms of a few welcome notes, feel free to go ahead and share in the chat your first name, where you're from, if you're an educator or a student leader, and if you've ever attended or had your students attend an online Model UN simulation. That way I can get a bit more of a feel of who's here, and you guys can start to get to know each other a little bit better as well. So feel free to start posting that information in the chat and begin to introduce yourselves. In terms of general Zoom etiquette for this webinar, please keep yourself muted if you're not speaking at that time. That way, it'll just prevent some of the sound from carrying across the Zoom platform in terms of those recordings that we might be sharing later. Also, I know it says here to turn off your video. Please actually feel free to leave those on. I'd love to see all of you as we go through this and to make this as interactive as possible. And if you think of any questions over the course of this event, feel free to post those in the chat box. And that way I can make sure that those get answered once we get to the end of this webinar. So to begin by introducing myself, hello everyone. My name is Georgina and I'm one of the program managers with Best Delegate. So a little bit about my Model UN backstory. I started doing Model UN when I was in 8th grade. And it was because I was terrified of public speaking. So I would get up in front of more than 5 people and I'd always have my speech written. Step 1, my hands would start shaking like crazy. Step 2, my face would turn as red as a tomato. Yes, that is possible. Step 3, I would want to run away from that stage as quickly as possible. So I had a friend at the time who I considered to be a mentor, and she was like, hey, you should try this activity called Model UN. I walked into that first club meeting and I never looked back. So much so that Model UN has inspired so much of my career and what I've done since then. As a result of my Model UN experience, I decided to attend Georgetown to study politics and served as Georgetown's head delegate my senior year, at which point I actually gave a speech in front of 3,500 people. And my hands weren't shaking, my face didn't turn red. From there, I actually spent a year working abroad and teaching Model UN to students across India as part of a UNODC partner project. And I served with the Peace Corps in Thailand. Now I find myself back with Best Delegate and continuing to share this Model UN knowledge, which I'm super excited to share with all of you today. With that, I'll also have Jaya introduce herself.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jaya, seeing a couple of familiar faces here today from the GCDC program. I serve as Senior Global Education Manager for the Global Classrooms DC program at UNA NCA. Just like Georgina, I started my Model UN journey in 9th grade. All throughout high school, I joined my Model UN club, instantly fell in love, and it 100% shaped my career trajectory. I ended up studying international affairs at GW. Although I didn't keep up with Model UN, I still engaged through different conferences. And now I'm here managing the very impactful Global Classrooms DC program, making the same impact on students throughout the DMV as Model UN had on me. So very happy to be here and thank you all for joining us.
Awesome. So in terms of what you can expect from this webinar, we're going to show you a step-by-step process for preparing for Model UN conferences, which you're then free to share with your students and empower their preparation and their own confidence with every committee that they encounter. So we're going to show you those 10 steps that we found make preparation for conferences super simple and create that effective process for preparation. From there, you'll actually get to practice some of those elements alongside our team. So we'll have you kind of interact with us and practice those elements as we go through this webinar. And then we'll share with you guys some top resources for your students and to help with that preparation, as well as future conferences that your students can attend using the knowledge that you guys will receive today. So welcome to our webinar on how to prepare for Model UN conferences on Zoom. Model UN is such an impactful activity that allows students to step into the shoes of those diplomats and really embrace those diplomatic principles and embrace those different perspectives and those different country policies. Now, the best Model UN committees happen when those students are prepared and when they feel prepared enough to share those ideas, to give those speeches, and to come up with those sustainable solutions, which is exactly what these 10 steps aim to accomplish in terms of creating that student preparedness and allowing your students to feel inspired and engaged with all of the material, as well as with their committee on the whole. So in terms of preparation, I'm going to begin by showing you the student checklist, which is also at the end of our How to Prepare guide, which I'll show you guys in just a bit. So in terms of those 10 steps, we've broken them down as well with research timetables. So the amount of time that each of these steps should take to allow your students to really envision what this process would look like. So beginning with reading the guide and watching videos. And then from there, moving into these different research elements and ending with those final preparation elements. And over the course of this webinar, we're going to break down each and every one of these steps for you, so you can get a sense of exactly what this would look like for your students to empower them when it comes to each of these elements. So to begin with step one is to read the How to Prepare guide. I believe that each of you would have received this guide prior to the webinar. And in the case you didn't, I will be sharing that link in the Zoom chat at the end of the webinar. So to begin preparing, students should begin by looking at this guide, which again overviews each of the steps that I'll be going through with you today to really help them out with that research process. Once they've done that, we recommend that students begin by watching Model UN training videos, no matter how much Model UN experience they may have. Through watching all of these different videos, it really gets students back into that debate mindset and back into that understanding of what Model UN committees are, what the expectations are. And some videos as well will provide them with context for more advanced elements. So for example, instructional lessons on how to deliver speeches and additional training that they can keep in mind as they move through their own research process. Now, once they've moved through those first two steps, your students will be completely ready to jump into that research and to begin specifically looking at their committee and at their country and at exactly what it is that they'll be debating at this conference, because each student is given a role and given a country and given a topic that they should be debating. So for the sake of this webinar, welcome to the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. Our topic for today is going to be the peaceful uses of outer space. And I'll feed this topic through the webinar and use this topic to demonstrate how your students would go about researching each and every one of these distinct elements, and how your students can go about understanding what that research process might specifically look like as they move through. So that first step in here is going to be to read the background guide. And I know that all of you were also emailed this background guide before this session. So in terms of understanding the background guide, you really want to point your students to these key elements, because that will set them up for the most success when it comes to their research. So in terms of those key elements from that background guide, they should begin by looking at the topic background, which gives them a distinct understanding of what the chair expects from them and of what this topic specifically is about, and all of the different aspects of this global challenge. From there, it'll get into past international action. So what the world and the international community have already done in efforts to deal with this international issue. From there, different subtopics to consider and different sub-issues. So aspects of this greater topic that they might want to break down and really focus on when it comes to really building up their research. From there, possible solutions. So what they might want to do to go about solving this issue, because the main goal of any Model UN committee is to tackle those global problems and for students to come together to write those resolutions, which comes from thinking about those possible solutions. And then these typically end with questions to consider. So once your students have read that background guide, they're ready to begin going into that research about the specific committee topic. So looking at exactly what this topic is and really breaking down that research to get a better understanding of what it is that they're debating. Because a lot of the time for students, they'll take a look at a topic, for example, the peaceful uses of outer space, and be like, that sounds really complicated, and that sounds really difficult, and that's something that global leadership is still tackling. So by looking through this specific research, they'll really be able to break that down and gain an understanding of these really broad topics. So in terms of researching the committee topic, you should begin by looking at the issues and begin by looking at what exactly does this topic mean to the international community. So we've broken that down into 4 separate steps. Step 1, define the problem. What exactly is this committee focusing on? What is the main issue that students should be addressing? From there, what are the primary causes? Why does this issue exist in the first place? What has caused this global issue to be a global issue? And what are the main causes that delegates can then later go about solving? From there, consider the effects. What has this topic caused? What's happening as a result of this global issue? And how can we handle those effects as members of the international community? And then finally, consider the impacts, the ramifications that this topic might have if left unsolved, and the impacts that this topic has on different communities. And a pro tip for this as well, the citations in the background guide are an excellent place to begin that research, and for students to really begin looking at what this topic is, because those are the same sources that those chairs would have used as they moved through their own research for the topic. So this is a very simple flowchart that we like to use to break this down, because Model UN topics are typically incredibly broad. So you want your students to break them down into specific issues and specific sub-issues that those students might want to be solving. So let me ask some of you, if any of you had a chance to go ahead and read that background guide. In terms of this Peaceful Uses of Outer Space Committee, what are some of the primary issues that you may have identified? If you were a student in this committee and any general knowledge you might have, when it comes to the peaceful uses of outer space, what might be some of the primary problems and the primary issues that students should focus on? If you've got an answer for me, feel free to raise a hand and share it or post it in the chat. All right, let's see. All right, we heard the topic discussed on NPR today. See, that's super interesting. Anyone else? Any main issues when it comes to the peaceful uses of outer space? Or anything you can think of off of the top of your head that would cause this to be a major problem for the international community? If you think of any issues, feel free to post them in the chat, and I've got a pre-made list for all of you as well. So if I were going about this issue, I would begin by defining the problem. Looking at that background guide, I define the problem as how should the international community be using outer space? What purposes should we be using outer space for? Because that's where the problem arises from, this lack of understanding of how outer space should be used by the international community. Now, what's caused that lack of understanding? So what are the primary causes that have led to this idea that international community and space is sort of undefined? So I looked through those causes. Number 1, outdated treaties. The most recent treaty written about outer space affairs was actually the MUN Agreement, which was written in 1984. Since 1984, technology has advanced exponentially, and the Outer Space Treaty was written before that. So those treaties are clearly outdated, which might be one of the reasons why this is a problem. Related to that, the technological development since those treaties were written. Because technology has evolved, this has continued to be a problem because there weren't any sort of implications for how that technology should be used. Then finally, a lack of regulations. There aren't any true regulations in outer space, which continues to cause disagreement over how countries should be using it. From there, consider the effects. Some of the effects of what's happening right now could be potential future conflicts. If there's no sense of enforcement, countries might end up getting into conflicts over uses of space. There's also potentially the issue of space debris. If there's no regulations on how space should be used, countries have the capacity to create that debris without any regulations about what to do about that. Then finally, what are the impacts on countries? There might be resource inequity if some countries get access to space first and others don't, which would thereby shift the balance of power in the international community. So I took this big topic and I broke it down into separate issues through defining the problem, looking at the causes, looking at the effects, and looking at those potential impacts. And then I took it back to that same flowchart, and I picked 2 main issues that I wanted to focus on. So 2 main issues that I think would be heavily important to this committee because they have ramifications for every country, and they're things that the international community really should be addressing. So for this topic, I focused on outdated treaties and I focused on militarization. Let me pause here. What questions do all of you have so far about defining that problem and about addressing that initial step of your research? If you've got a question, feel free to post it in the chat box or raise a hand for me and I'll go ahead and answer it. Yes, Beth, what question do you have?
Okay, can you go back one slide?
Mhm.
So this is a very good analysis and synthesis, you know what I'm saying, of information. How much research would students be doing to take that topic and get down to these defining the problem? And let's assuming that their research would be focused on not just like general knowledge of the problem and issues, but specifically how it would be applied to things that might be done at the United Nations that might involve a community. Are there specific types of sites that you're encouraging kids to use, or is it just get on that Google and start researching?
There are definitely specific sites that we recommend using, and I will actually mention a few of those just a little bit later. But in terms of this research as well and what students can expect, a lot of these things they can actually pull from the background guide if they look at the different sub-issues listed, as well as that general topic background. So a lot of these elements are actually typically already touched on. So if they analyze those key elements from the background guide and then proceed to do certain source searches, they'll be able to pretty quickly pull out this information. And depending on how often they're used to researching, this becomes a much simpler process. Did that answer the first parts of your question?
It did. And by the background guide, are you talking about this one that we have? No.
Correct. Yes. So for any Model UN conference as well, students will be provided a background guide by the committee itself, which essentially gives a solid overview of what that topic might look like.
Oh, that is very helpful. So you're saying just like we got the one for the space, they're going to get it on the, okay, that's great. Thank you.
Absolutely. So to move on from there, once you've gotten a little bit more context about what this topic is, and a little bit more context on what's the main problem and the main issues, you're ready to start specifically looking at your country and what your assigned country believes the international community should do in terms of addressing this major global challenge. So you want to begin by looking at your country profile. So learning as much general information as you can about the country that you're representing. Key elements of your country's profile that are definitely relevant to the way that they would interact with the international community. First is the type of government your country has, whether it's a democracy, whether it's slightly a more authoritarian regime. That government type will influence how your country responds to certain topics. From there, geography. Where is your country located? For a lot of these topics, these issues happen differently for different regions. So by knowing where your country is located and those geographic neighbors, you can isolate specific issues that happen and are related to your country. From there, look at your country's economy. What is your country's GDP? How many resources do you have? Who are your trading partners? Which will give you insights again into how your country interacts with the rest of these UN member states. And then finally, allies. By figuring out who your country typically works with, you line yourself up to be able to better interact with other delegates in that committee. So by looking at those allies, you're able to very quickly get a better understanding of how your country works with those other countries. And in terms of a great research source, we've got a best delegate research map on our website, and I'll send the link to that in the chat at the end of this webinar, which gives a lot of great information about specific countries if you click on that specific pin on the map. So once you've researched your country profile, you want to figure out what your country's policy is when it comes to handling this topic. So your country's policy is essentially what your country believes the international community should be doing in terms of solving this general issue. Now, we've got this great acronym. When you're hunting for your country's policy, and when you're hunting for solutions, you need a spear. So essentially what you want to look for: speeches, programs, events, agreements, and reports. So speeches by your country's leader, specifically related to this topic. Programs your country has implemented that again relate to the topic at hand. Events that your country has attended, whether they be major UN meetings, whether they be smaller summits with other countries. Those events will again give you insight into what your country believes the world should do. Agreements. What treaties has your country already signed? Has your country signed the MUN Agreement in this case, or the Outer Space Treaty? So look at those agreements to get insights into that country policy. And then reports. Reports will provide you with statistics and analyses of exactly what this situation looks like. And those statistics are great tools to use in your research and to analyze the outcomes of this topic. Now, a great way to do Google searches, and I think this will best answer your question, Beth. There's simply a way to almost hack Google. So if you want to make sure that every website you get is a UN website, type into Google site:UN.org, the name of your country, and the topic that you're looking for. Every website you get is going to be a UN website, which will ensure that all of your research is specifically from those UN sources, which means that that research is a great way to get started in terms of approaching that committee. So in terms of the United States, and in terms of this mock committee topic that I've given all of you, I did a little research on the United States. So the US is a constitutional federal republic with a pretty large GDP compared to the rest of the world, which means that the US is typically considered to be a global leader on a lot of international topics. Now, when it comes to those allies, the US is a member of NATO. So when I'm thinking about my research, I might also want to think about what NATO's done and think about how to work with those other NATO countries, specifically because this topic is a security topic. From there, I started to look into spheres, so into my country's policy, which led me to realize that when it comes to the peaceful uses of outer space, the United States is really focused on long-term sustainability. So finding sustainable ways to use resources, sustainable ways to interact with the outer space environment without taking away those resources for future years. The United States also uses a lot of private enterprises and partners with those private organizations to boost their ability to enter that space environment. Then finally, the United States is a member of the Artemis Accords, which is a bilateral international agreement which essentially has a lot of countries that agreed to this sustainability and who agreed to use outer space peacefully. And it also established safe zones, wherein if different countries are operating in certain regions, that means that they inform other countries. So those countries don't try and operate there, which would potentially cause conflict. So that would be how to look at that profile and a very short glance into how the United States or this country would approach this topic. Let me pause again. What questions do all of you have for me so far in terms of building on that research and looking at your country profile and your policy? Any questions? Okay, seeing none, I will continue. So from there, you want to begin to brainstorm your solutions. And this is going to be the most important aspect of any student's research. Because as I mentioned earlier, the goal of any Model UN committee is for all of these countries to come together to solve these global issues in a way that's sustainable, in the same way that the United Nations does even today, looking toward that Sustainable Development Goal agenda and really working towards creating that sustainable future for all of the 193 member states. So by brainstorming those positive solutions before even getting to the committee, delegates will feel confident in their solutions. They'll feel confident in their speeches, and they'll feel confident in their ability to interact with others and to write down those solutions in a way that they can get them passed and look towards that sustainable future for the international community. So when it comes to brainstorming solutions, this can be broken down into a 4-step process. And in just a bit, I'm actually going to have all of you do this as well. So you want to begin by looking at the list of issues you've identified. So take that list of main issues that you think will be relevant to that committee. From there, use spheres, once again, to identify the solutions your country is already implementing. Because as you researched your country's policy, a lot of what you researched was solutions. For example, programs. Any program is typically a solution. Any event that was hosted probably produced an agreement, which would also be considered a solution to this major topic. So take those issues and look towards your country policy and those spheres to consider the solutions that already exist. Once you've got a list of those solutions, so you want to see if there's a solution for each issue that you've identified. Once you've got that solution list, you want to analyze those solutions. Are they effective or are they not? Once you've analyzed the efficacy, from there, it's up to the delegates. Do they want to continue to develop those solutions to make them more effective, or do they want to create new solutions? So to bring out that flowchart just a little bit further, you start with your main topic. Then you break it down into primary issues. And for each of those issues, your students should focus on finding at least one solution, which means that they'll always have things to discuss when it comes to debate, and always have ideas when it comes to working with others and really presenting their country in that positive light, and presenting exactly what their country aims to do within the international community. So in terms of that issues list, I went back to looking at those key issues that I mentioned earlier. So I started off with those outdated treaties and the fact that the most recent treaty related to outer space is from the 1980s, which is definitely slightly problematic. From there, that potential for militarization, which is a lot of what's being discussed today, and I think countries' greatest worries when it comes to that potential use of outer space in the future. So countries really wanting to avoid that militarization, but the potential that that has to happen in the future. Other issues that I identified: sustainability and resource sharing. The fact that countries have yet to decide how to use those resources in the case they extract them from space. How would countries go about sharing those? How would countries go about ensuring that they're using them sustainably? From there, the level of technological development and the fact that technology is developing so quickly that it's hard for those treaties to keep up. From there, national sovereignty and how that would work in terms of the space environment. And finally, private versus public enterprises. So I built out this long list of issues, and those top two I mentioned earlier, in terms of issues that I really would have wanted to address as a delegate within this context. So from there, put those back in that flow chart and start to consider what might be the solutions to each of these issues, and how might the international community go about solving these. So I, as a delegate, could go about proposing those effective solutions. So in terms of the solutions that the United States had proposed, number one was that Artemis Agreement, which, if passed by the international community, could serve as an updated treaty. So replacing some of those outdated treaties or finding ways to make them more modern and more applicable in today's context. The United States has also looked towards models for sustainability, which relates back to some of those issues. And then finally, the United States is really big on public-private partnerships in terms of finding ways to create new technology efficiently and finding ways to move forward within that environment. So from there, I would take those solutions and figure out how effective are they? Are they working? Looking at those solutions, the Artemis Accord is a great idea, but it's only been signed on by a small number of countries, which means in its current state, it might not work as effectively as it could. Looking towards, again, that sustainability. Even though the United States might have models and ideas for that sustainable usage, if other countries don't agree with them, and if those aren't put into legislation, how can it be guaranteed that that will work? Public-private partnerships, on the other hand, do seem to be working pretty effectively, and a lot of countries do tend to use those. So that might be one super effective solution that I looked at. So from there, I would take those solutions and figure out how can I develop them to make them stronger. So for example, for the Artemis Accords, if I firmly believed that this could work on an international scale, and if I firmly believed that other countries could get involved with this, I would create that as a solution and find a way to build that out to be a more internationally applicable program. The same goes for those models for sustainability. How could I make them more internationally applicable and develop that to be a broader solution? In the case that you found an issue that there simply is no solution for, and this does tend to happen, that's where your students would get to create their own and really step into the shoes of leadership and spearhead those new solutions that they could really look towards as they move forward. So from here, What I'm actually going to do is for the next 5 or so minutes, have each of you in small breakout rooms go through and as a group start to brainstorm how you would go about doing this. So what I'm going to do is create 2 breakout rooms and break you up into random groups. With each breakout room, I'm going to share you on an editable Google Doc template, which essentially will have a space to write out issues and a space to write out solutions. Don't worry if you don't know anything at all about this topic. It's more of an exercise that you could then do with your students later. So getting in that practice and looking at ways to really continue with that research. So give me just a moment to create 2 breakout rooms. Once you're all in there, I will move in and drop in those Google Docs and spend about 5 minutes before they close discussing how you would go about this, as well as how you might share this information with your students and push your students to go through this same research process. All right, great, awesome. Cool. So feel free to go ahead and join those breakout rooms. And what I'll do is go ahead and drop in those Google Doc templates once you're each in those breakout rooms. At the end of those 5 minutes, you'll all come right back here.
Like thinking about their country and then other countries is where I'm like, we need to get the conversation a little bit further. So I think this idea of the pre-existing solutions is really helpful to give them that first step back into it.
Absolutely. Let me just check. Okay. So Melvin, who was in the other breakout room, it looks like he might have had to leave for, is he here? Okay.
Not yet.
There we go. Awesome. So Melvin also actually mentioned a great idea while I was sitting in there, which I'd actually like to share with all of you as well. When it comes to also brainstorming those solutions, it's fantastic to as well show your students what's a great model for international solutions that exist today. What are some of those preeminent solutions that are working, even if they're for different topics, and allow students to analyze why those solutions work so well. Because a lot of those pathways will be applicable to any topic in terms of the reasons for which those solutions are so effective. A main one that I can immediately think of is the Sustainable Development Goals, which got every UN member state on board because every member state agreed. These are goals the international community wants to work towards. And these are different issues that all of our countries are facing, at least in some sense. And they found a way to internationalize those targets and a way to get every country to buy in to making the world a more sustainable place by 2030. So that's definitely a great model to start to show your students and to feed in to a lot of those solutions that they also work towards as well. Are there any other ideas that any of you heard in terms of brainstorming those solutions that you would be sharing with your students? If you've got any other advice you'd like to share, feel free to raise a hand and share it before I continue with the presentation. So any other ideas in terms of brainstorming those solutions and how to really guide your students towards that success point? Okay. Seeing none, I'll go ahead and continue. Just a sec. Awesome. So this is what that would eventually look like. So you take your main topic, you list out those main issues, and you would fill in those final boxes with your solutions. So having all of those ideas already listed out. So that way, when your delegates get to committee, if they build out a flowchart like this, say that, for example, outdated treaties is mentioned as a moderated caucus topic. Your students already have solutions that they can bring up in debate. The same goes for militarization and goes for any issues that your students have identified solutions for. So your students will feel confident discussing any of these issues and will have solutions ready when it comes to whichever issue decides to take precedence within that committee. So by having this flowchart built out, your students will be very easily able to glance down at their notes and say, okay, this is this main issue and this is how I'm going to solve it. So it creates a very simple model for students to look back to and to continue to use and build out over the course of their committee as well. So once students have done their research, learned about the topic, learned about their country, defined those main issues, and started to think about their solutions, when it comes to feeling as prepared as possible, the next step in that preparation journey would actually be to write their opening speech, which is their first chance in that committee to share their country's policy. And a moment that I know for many students, especially shyer students, is a little bit nerve-wracking, especially since it's that first speech that they'll give within a committee. So by writing that opening speech beforehand and getting feedback from their peers or feedback from their MUN advisor or educator, they'll walk into that committee feeling confident about that first speech. And a successful first speech line them up to feel confident for the rest of the committee, as well as confident to shine and really share their solutions. So in terms of a great model for an opening speech, you always want to begin with a hook, something catchy to get that audience to listen. And especially over Zoom, hooks are great to ensure that you do get that audience attention. Because on Zoom, we've seen that sometimes students do tend to burn out, just by nature of looking at that screen for such a long time. So by ensuring that a speech begins with a hook, the audience will immediately latch on and realize that this speech is interesting and I really want to hear more. So what does a good hook look like? Potentially a short story related to an event within your country, related to the topic at hand. A quote from your country's leader or a thought leader when it comes to this topic. Ask a question to the audience, not expecting an answer because that would break parliamentary procedure, beginning with a general open-ended question and pausing to get the audience to think before that speech is continued. Or beginning with a startling statistic, something that raises awareness as to why this topic needs to be solved now. From there, their main points. Every speech should have maximum 3 points, or else it winds up being way too long and not focusing on a specific aspect of this topic. In terms of those points, those are your country's policy. So that's why all of that research is critical before this speech. If you're strong on your country's policy, the points in your speech will be super successful, and you'll be able to convey all of those ideas that your country believes in. And then always end with a call to action. Leave the audience with something to think about. In this case, the best call to action being propose one of your solutions, which will immediately get you feedback from other delegates. Because with most conferences, delegates can send notes. They can use that chat box to begin to interact with one another. If your students propose a solution, they'll typically immediately get questions about it or get feedback on it, which allows them to interact with others and think about how they might want to implement it. So essentially, this all comes from research steps 3 through 6. So by doing that research, your students will be super prepared to write that opening speech. Once they've done that, they should review how to write a resolution. Because as I've mentioned a few times, the main goal of a Model UN committee is to pass that resolution and to take action to solve this topic at hand. So by reviewing how to write a resolution, students will feel far more confident actually going through that process when they're within that committee context. So what does a resolution look like? A resolution has 3 key elements, and a really successful trick I found when explaining this to my students. This is exactly like writing a paper for school. The header is where you'd write your name, the subject, and the date. It's pretty similar in a Model UN committee. Next, in a paper at school, you have your introduction. That's what your pre-ambulatory clauses are, and I'll get into that in just a slide. But essentially, your pre-ambulatory clauses are the introduction to your paper, and your operative clauses are your argument. So your main solutions that your country is spearheading. So even though it might have formal language, it's no different than any paper your students have ever written. The only difference being that slight little bit of formality. And if your students have done their research using that flowchart, here's a super simple trick. Suddenly, these issues become your preambulatory clauses or your introduction. Those solutions become operative clauses. So for each issue and each preambulatory clause, your students hypothetically would have solutions. So at least 2 operative clauses that they could write for each of those issues, which would lead them to feel incredibly prepared when it came to that resolution writing, because right in front of them, they'd have a model for exactly what they wanted for each of those aspects. So issues as preambulatory clauses and solutions as operative clauses. So really tying everything together, not just from that research, but bringing it forward into that resolution aspect. So in terms of those preambulatory clauses, as I mentioned, these are the issues that your students want to solve. So the introduction to this topic at hand, where you introduce the problem and introduce exactly what the issues are. In terms of formatting, italicized phrase, and with a comma. So going back to that space committee, my example was noting the foundations for international space regulations set by the Outer Space Treaty. That's one of the preeminent treaties that I decided to recall within that introductory space. And as a second preambulatory clause, I would probably mention the issue with how outdated these treaties are. From there, your operative clauses, in which you recommend your solutions. And the same goes with any paper at school. Your introduction should be much shorter than the main part of your essay. You should always have more solutions than issues. You do not want your resolution to be a laundry list of issues. Rather, you want it to present sustainable solutions for the international community. These begin with an underlined phrase, they're numbered, and they end with a semicolon, except for the last one, which ends with a period. Because resolutions are essentially one long sentence when you look at them grammatically. So the solution that I came up with recommends hosting an annual meeting on the ISS to update the Outer Space Treaty and related regulations. So to deal with that issue of outdated treaties, I decided to propose a way for the international community to annually readdress those, to ensure that they don't get outdated again, and ensure that there's that sustainable pathway moving forward. So once your students have done all of that, another great thing that they should do before any committee is just review Model UN terms. Because Model UN, as you're all probably aware, has its own language and is very formal in terms of that parliamentary procedure. So by reviewing those key terms, they'll feel really confident when they hear each of these. I still remember my first Model UN conference. I walked in and I didn't really know many Model UN terms. And everyone was like, the chair will take points or motions. I was sitting there and was like, who are these crazy people talking about chairs like they're humans? So by reviewing the key Model UN terms, you can ensure that your students do not go through that same experience and that they feel confident when it comes to that terminology. Then finally, when it comes to Zoom, the last step is to set up that technology to ensure that students can actually participate once they log into the Zoom meeting. So in terms of setting up tech, our pro tips: ensure that you're in a quiet space without any barking dogs, sirens, anything along those lines, to ensure that students don't get distracted. Adjust the lighting. It's creepy when students are sitting in the dark. Frame the video. A few times I've had students who are like peering into the camera incredibly closely. So just remind students to frame their video appropriately. Also, silence other notifications to cut down on those distractions and ensure that students test that technology. So you've got this, and so do your students. So before I move into a quick poll for all of you, as well as sharing some helpful resources, what questions do you have for me that I can answer about any of these steps that I've gone through so far? Are there any other questions and any other questions that you have that I can answer? If you've got a question, throw up a raised hand and I will go ahead and answer that. Yeah, Audrey, what question do you have?
Georgina, first, I want to thank you so much for a marvelous presentation. It was so useful and very helpful. I'm very excited about sharing some of these tips with our students. The question I have for you is, what are some tips you might have on navigating the UN Digital Library?
That is a great question because the UN Digital Library is a massive resource. So when it comes to navigating the UN Digital Library, actually what I would tend to do is first encourage my students to power search to find specifically what they're looking for. So rather than beginning within that UN library, use that power search on Google with site:UN.org, or even make it more specific to exactly what the UN library web address is. So site: the web address for the UN library, and then specifically their country's name and the topic they're looking for. And that way Google will provide them with exactly the links that will lead them to that research. In terms of the UN library as well, I believe there are ways to break it down by country. And from there are ways to isolate certain subtopics. So I would recommend beginning with their country and figuring out kind of what they've signed and anything along those lines. Did that answer your question? Awesome. Tina, what question do you have?
Yes, I had to zoom out to take a call, but I don't know if you covered this, but I was interested in how you can look at the screen, how you put your text, as you're talking so that you look more at the person. other than looking down at your notes?
Definitely. So what I would tend to do if I were a student and I wanted it to seem like I was looking into the camera, I might actually take my notes and put them on the side of my laptop screen. So I have them literally up next to the left of the camera. And that way, when I was reading off of my notes, I would still look as if I was looking directly into that screen. So finding a way to really create that engagement and make it look as if I am looking at the audience. We have a similar tip as well for when this is done in person for shy students to actually look at people's foreheads rather than look directly into their eyes if it's a student who's a little shyer. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and begin to talk about some additional Model UN resources. So Jaya, if you want to go ahead and discuss Global Classrooms DC resources, and then I'll take it over from there, and then we'll head into that poll.
Yes, so as you all know, those of you who are involved in the GCDC program, we have our very exciting Spring Model UN Conference coming up this April, virtually, of course, to keep us all safe. We have some exciting new things happening with the Spring Conference, even though that it is virtual, including an exclusive roundtable with UN experts and former ambassadors for students who perform best in their committees. So really trying to incentivize them to do that research, perform well, so that they get to talk with UN experts directly. Georgina, if you could just go to the next slide. And we have very exciting topics for you all for the school year. Most of these should look familiar as they directly relate to content that is within the GCDC curriculum, but we'll also be having experts during the Zoom sessions for students to bounce ideas off of, really serve as an encouragement force. We call them policy advisors, but really, again, having them as a resource for students to discuss ideas, discuss resolutions, and really just, again, serve as an encouragement for. So if you haven't signed up already, definitely encourage you all. You should have all received the link in the newsletter, and I'm happy to pop it in the chat as well.
Awesome. And aside from those seriously incredible GCDC opportunities that I absolutely recommend you sign your students up for, if your students would like a little additional practice and a few additional Model UN committees this spring, we also at Best Delegate have a list of other conferences that we think are excellent ones. So we've got a full conference database that I'll actually post the link to in the chat, in the case you're looking for additional conferences for your students to attend this spring. We also host our own virtual Model UN conferences. So in terms of upcoming conferences, we host training conferences, which are a great forum for newer delegates. The chairs for those conferences really ensure that they go through and explain each step of procedure to those newer delegates. So we've got one in March and one in April. We also offer invitationals for those more advanced students. So students who really want to push themselves in terms of that debate, which are going to be on March 20th and April 17th. And that registration for our March conference does close on February 15th. So we'll go ahead and send those Zoom links in the chat in just a bit. Now from here as well, I'm going to quickly send out a poll just so that you guys can reflect on your experience over the course of this session. So I've just launched a poll. If all of you could go ahead and fill that out, that would be fantastic. And I just want to say on behalf of Jaya and myself, thank you so much for attending this webinar. It was really great to share with each of you these different research steps and all of these elements of preparation. And I'm really looking forward to how each of you can continue to impact your students through Model UN moving forward. So a huge thank you.
And a huge thank you to you as well, Georgina. Like I said, this is the first time GCDC is partnering with Best Delegate, and I think I can say for all the attendees here, I definitely learned a lot about the research process for Model UN, definitely learned a lot of tips for our students, and we're so thankful that we were able to coordinate this with you.
Happy to do it, of course. And so for any of you who didn't receive that guide, I just posted the link in the chat box, as well as links to a training video library and that conference database, in the case that you're interested in looking through those. Awesome. And once you've all completed that poll, if you have any final questions you've thought of, feel free to ask them. And if not, you're completely free to go. And thank you so much for attending today's webinar.
Thank you very much, Georgina. Good luck to everyone. We look forward to seeing you in the springtime.
And Jaya,